Okay. Welcome to Fossil Creek Nursery and Tree Farm. Today we're going to be talking about vegetables and herbs, and I guess and fall gardening. So the first thing to say is, um, if you look in literature about when should I plant this, one of the first things they'll say for a fall garden is this much in front of the first freeze date. And our average first frost around here is November 15th. It could be December 15th. But the average is November 15th. And of course, the good thing for us about fall gardening is even when those freezes happen, typically they're not that cold and they don't last very long. Sometimes the freezing temperatures are just all part of the deal. Jets fly over, loaders drive by. Uh, uh, the uh, the good thing is they don't last very long, and we can have a freeze, and then the next 2 or 3 weeks are great. So, and most of the things we're talking about here, almost all, a light freeze or frost, it's not going to bother them in the least. So, if you're worried about cold, don't worry about it, because it take a real disaster, which happen every 50 years, to give us any problems. So typically that's not something we need to be concerned about. And fall and with it winter is probably the most underused gardening, especially for food crops, and for that matter for everything. Winter is one of the most underutilized seasons, and fall's pretty close. And of course, fall has ended up being my favorite because it means that no more 100-degree days. And this is a wonderful year to have that behind us. And so, like I say, most of these things will love the fall weather. And of course, a bunch of the leaf crops that we're going to be talking about, they will actually taste better after we've had some light freezes. So it's not a bad thing. The reason I have these little flowers here, we're not really going to talk about them because this is about vegetables and herbs. But I had to bring them out here for a show of, see, when we get in petunias, we don't have pansies yet. It's a little early. We get petunias before we get pansies, but that means the inferno is behind us. Cooler weather is coming close. So, and the same for snapdragons and dianthus. So they've had their 15 seconds. So now but the other point about them is that just because you're doing edible things doesn't mean you can't mix in some pretty stuff. In fact, some of the popular flowers, I don't have any marigolds yet, probably have them soon. They're one of the popular companion planting things, and they will go all through the fall. And let's see. So we've got, for fall gardening, you can do transplants, or you can do seeds. And of course, September is the time. And there's, in fact, one of the most important things about vegetable gardening is timing. In fact, when people say, I planted some so-and-so vegetables and didn't have any luck at all, it was just a real failure. The most common cause for the failure is bad timing. If you plant it at the wrong time, or you don't give it enough time, and the weather comes in and cuts it off before it's mature or it's produced, well, then your timing was off. And of course, some plants have more of a window than others. In spring, tomatoes have a window because you want them to grow and set their crops and grow their tomatoes before it gets real hot. So that's kind of a window thing. You always typically are going to use a transplant for those. But in the fall, the main thing is you want to get them started as soon as the weather is somewhat milder, which it'll be 90 degrees or whatever, but that's mild compared to 110. So the sooner you get them in the ground, the better, because they see they've got roots. They're raring to go, and I refer to these little pots as captivity, because they'll grow to a certain size, and that's about it in a little pot. Because see, these guys have got roots all over. They're anxious to get underway, so the sooner they're out of that pot and into a bigger situation, the better. All plants are more resilient and productive based on their root structure. So they can't, the top of it is not going to go away and surpass what's underground, because that's what, the leaves, photosynthesis, they make food, but they're dependent on the roots for, of course, obviously, for one of the big things, water and fertilizers that they pick up from the soil. So getting them underway is one of the big things. Of course, it may go without saying, I'll say it anyway. Of course, it always helps to grow things that you like, if nobody's going to eat it. Well, I won't say it's a waste, because a lot of the vegetables are highly ornamental, and you may have a rabbit, a pet rabbit or something, I don't know. But they're highly ornamental, but plant what you like, but at the same time, be willing to experiment, because let's see, I think in here I've got somewhere. Look, I've got turnips. I don't remember eating a turnip. And I think I've got parsnips in here, and I know I've never eaten one of those, but I've heard they're very good. Sometimes they're cooked like, grilled like steaks. So anything that they do that with can't be all bad. So don't rule out experimenting, because the thing that's in their favor is, just as a general rule, things that you pick out of your garden in your yard, they're fresh. And that tends to be a real boost in the flavor department. So, of course, with the caveat that some of them, like I mentioned before, they're going to taste better once we've had some cool weather. But up until then, you're just growing them. They're not at the eating stage anyway. And of course, timing is important, because too, you can, let's see, some things are quick. Talk about timing. Radishes win the contest from seed to eating a radish. I've seen some of these packets on some varieties, they say as little as 24 days. The more common figure would be like 30 days. I planted some, I guess, a few years ago in one of our raised beds here, and I thought, these guys are going to have to hurry up if they're going to make that 30-day thing. I don't know if they heard me, but they did hurry up. The second 2 weeks, they kind of exploded. And I was eating radishes about that big around in 30 days. So they will do it. So don't be discouraged by the first couple weeks, because they accelerate. Of course, and that brings up another thing you can do, and this is one of the really good crops for it. We have different ones. Here's one for the kids, the Easter egg assorted colors. Cherry bell's a oldie but a really goodie. good flavor and texture. And then, of course, French breakfast, a longer one. But they're all quick. And the thing about that is, if you like radishes, maybe the whole family doesn't, but the key being that since they're quick, you can do, and you're doing them from seed, you can do succession planting. You don't plant the whole package at once, because what happens if you plant the whole package at once? They're all ready at the same time. Are you going to be ready to eat a whole package worth of radishes? Probably not. And of course, the other thing about radishes, and this is like individual things, qualities about the different crops, when they're ready, they're ready. If you leave them there, they won't immediately get worse, but they're not something that you want to leave in the ground for another 30 days. When they're ready, you could go 35 days or 40, but they tend to get bigger and kind of get pithy. So you want to pick them on time. So the way you do that is you don't plant the whole packet at once. You plant some of it, and then a week later, or 2 weeks, but a week would be enough, week or 10 days, you plant some more, and then a week or 10 days after that, you plant some more. So the number of radishes becoming ripe are what you're in the market to eat. And once you've consumed those, the next crop, a few days later, it will be ready. So you want to avoid the feast or famine thing, and that's how you do it with these. You could somewhat do the same thing with things like lettuce. Not quite as much, because there's not an urge to harvest. And with lettuce, you're not really harvesting the whole plant. You're picking off leaves. So it's not as much of a candidate as radishes. And we'll go through a few of the different plants. And of course, keep in mind, you may not know what you like or don't like. So a little bit of adventure is called for. So, and this is one of my favorites, if nothing else for the name. This is a kale, which is a great cool weather plant. It'll go through the winter, and you can harvest them like you do lettuce, picking off leaves. But it's simply salad mix kale storm. Is that a good name or what? That's one of those I wish I thought of that. And given 100 years, I might have. But, and of course, kale are one of those things that are nutritious and highly ornamental. So they're fun. Broccoli, stem broccoli, this was called artwork. So it's probably going to be pretty too. And of course, the plants like that, broccoli, to get to be a big plant, you're going to harvest the top of it, but you're not going to take the plant. You cut the big top out, it will continue to produce offshoots and side shoots. And of course, broccoli, you know what broccoli is. It's a flower bud. So if it starts turning yellow, you've waited too long. That's the flowers opening up. But that big flower bud up there, when you harvest it, the big one, just take it out and it will produce more offshoots and side shoots. They won't be quite as big, but they will keep producing try to produce flowers. So those will be flower buds. And cabbage, Savoy drumhead. And let's see, we had another one here. And I guess his cousin, Stonehead. Golden cross, and you can kind of see from the picture that would be a kind of an ornamental one too. And Brussels sprouts, and that one's extremely winter hardy and makes a big plant. So that's one that you would want to do from a transplant and get in the ground right away. And kohlrabi, which is kind of a cross between a leaf vegetable and a root. And of course, this one, again, it's a broken record. They're pretty. And these guys, when they get more mature, the veins in the leaf become more prominent. And one that's really neat about that is collards. The leaves get really big, and the veins in the leaves get really white. So they're another nutritious but highly ornamental, and they're going to get big. And you can harvest over a long period of time. And there's arugula, or a common name for it is rocket. You know, see those in a vegetable. If you have one that's a, upper crust salad, it's going to have some of that in it. And of course, it also has a nice name, wasabi. How can you say no to wasabi? And another kale, red Russian, just starting to color up. And of course, that's the thing. The other thing that you see that in ornamental kale too, and it's the same with the edible kale. Not only does the flavor improve, but the color is going to be, enhanced dramatically once the weather cools down. And we've got some variety here, which, let me see. Here we go. Cauliflower, cheddar. See a little bit of a cheese color, and if you don't quite notice it, if you put it up against the white, it's dramatic. Of course, now you hear a lot more about cauliflower now, that you can get your pizza with cauliflower crust. Might not mean much to you, but I'm diabetic, and it means I can eat the crust. So that's kind of neat. Chinese cabbage, another cool weather guy that's ornamental. And lettuces are one of those where there's a big assortment. They're productive over a long period of time. These two here, they're from a variety called a bistro mix, so different colors. And that's a well, if that thing wasn't moving around, I wouldn't be here. So it's hard to be mad. Lettuce, dark red, Lola Rosa, and oldie but goodie, butter crunch. So neat foliage. And of course, around here, the lettuces that you're going to have are going to be big leaf lettuces. The head lettuce. I think you're going to have to move to the Pacific Northwest or somewhere milder than here. The leaf lettuces tend to work better here, not head lettuces, which is not really a bad thing, because you can keep picking parts of them and they keep growing. Whereas a head lettuce, you harvest the head and then that's it. So they're good in that regard. And contrary to what you may read in the literature, which I'm going to tell you about some of the literature. Texas Fruit and Vegetable Gardening by Greg Grant. He's a local guy, I think 5th or 6th or 7th generation East Texas. So he's been here a while, and he's been gardening the whole time. So this is a great book, gives you details on all the different crops. And that's Texas Fruit and Vegetable Gardening by Greg Grant. He's a Texas guru. East Texas guru. Did you know that East Texas had gurus? Well, they do. Greg Grant's one of them. Who would have thought? It's a great book, and if you ever get the chance to hear one of his presentations, he's a hoot. It's fun. But anyway, you may see in literature, and I don't go by everything that's in a book because we can color outside the lines and there are no penalties. So they will say that, you know, a hard freeze is going to take out lettuce. Well, I've been here 8.5 years, and when we have lettuce on the table and a hard freeze comes, I practice tough love, which means no love, just tough. It's like, I hope you're ready. It's going to get really cold tonight, and we're not going to help you. And on really cold nights, the lettuce leaves will really get scorched and nipped by the freeze. And the next day, I just come out and do a little surgery. And 4 or 5 days later, they put out a bunch more leaves. So it will ugly them up thoroughly if it really gets cold. But I've never seen them killed. So, and of course the same thing, and of course lettuce are not as cold hardy as cabbage and kale and you know, the other cold crops. So, but that's why I said at the beginning, don't be intimidated by the cold weather's coming. You know, it's like, and there aren't, you know, this is not a guarantee. The only thing that's guaranteed, we all know that, death and taxes. Okay, that's a guarantee. But, you know, so we're not guaranteed, but it could happen. But I wouldn't spend any time worrying about it. Let's all head full, and if it gets nipped, you know, we'll trim it. If it were to get killed, hey, you know, that's life. So then you know you've been living on the edge. It kind of heightens the experience when you're living on the edge. So I'll go through seeds in a minute. We'll also talk a little bit about herbs. A lot of the herbs are perennials. A lot. And then a few of them are tender perennials. And then there are some, and while we're at it, I guess we'll define that. Winter hardy. They come back. Most of the herbs that are perennials are evergreen perennials. They don't go away. When it gets real cold, they say, no problem. So the exception to that, you know, if you want to do basil, it's an annual. And not only does it not like freezes, it doesn't even like chili. So at 40 degrees, it'll probably wilt. It gets freezing, you know, it's done. But it's quick. And you can be trimming it all the time. And it doesn't take very many of them to supply probably what your family is going to consume. And of course, you don't want these. And if you're using them, they're not going to go to flower because you're trimming off the tops where the flowers are going to be produced. So that takes care of that. If some of them were to bud and start to bloom, you go back about 3 nodes and cut it off, and you're back into vegetation growth, you know. It's like a lot of gardening, some pruning is involved. So, and of course, some of the big evergreens, and this is one of the benefits of where we are in North Texas. Here, not only does our ground not freeze, it doesn't even get cold. You know, I've used a soil thermometer in our flower beds, in our turf areas, like the end of January or beginning of February. And I think I used a genuine food thermometer that goes 0 to 200. And it reads pretty accurate, and it costs about $8. And I stick it 2 or 3 inches down. And in the cold part of the winter, 2 or 3 inches down, the coldest reading I've ever gotten was 52. Pretty doggone warm. So Roots on plants typically, if the soil temperature is 40 degrees or above, they're active. So that means they're active. You know, the roots have got it going on all through our winter. So that's another reason why don't be intimidated by it, because the roots are raring to go because they're loving it. Anyway, so my point being, which I'll get to now, is that we really don't have much of a winter. So a lot of these things, you know, they don't miss a beat. Rosemary, this one is a bunch of different varieties. Barbecue, and it's a culinary variety. And one of the reasons it got its name is, you can see it's got big straight stalks. As it gets bigger, you can trim that bigger stalk and skewer something and put it on the barbecue. So it's not only culinary, but it's got a big stem that you can use to skewer things that you're going to put on the barbecue. And we've got a couple others here, not to mention the fact, and of course one plant, you know, for culinary use, one plant's going to cover the family. But they are have a neat appearance, and they have a decent growth rate, so it's not going to just sit there. And of course we've got the other one here. We have different sizes. This is a 4-inch size, and this is a Tuscan blue rosemary, which in rosemary circles it would have the title of workhorse. It's a culinary variety, but it can get 6 or 7 feet tall. So, but that's up to you, and it'll get as tall as you let it get, or as wide as you let it get, or whatever. So I want to mention that because a lot of times when people ask, how big will that get? And if I say something like that, they're like, oh, I'm not going to do it overnight. This isn't a science fiction movie, and you're the one that decides how big it gets. You know, they have no resistance whatsoever to being pruned. They don't lean away or whatever. You know, it's up to you. But a hardy variety, looks good, gets big, and that's something, since it gets so big, if you want to do creative shapes, that'd be the one to do. And let's see, okay. And this one, and of course, they'll have a little bit different, some of them a little bit different colors. This one is ARP, and I think the story on him decades ago, I guess by now. That one was discovered somewhere in Texas. It's ARP is how you spell the name, and it's particularly hardy. And you can see it's got a little bit more of a gray appearance. So, but would also be culinary. But you know, if rosemary wasn't culinary, it'd be worth it for just the shrub that it makes. And even if you don't eat it, you can have a snort once in a while, which is pretty good. And of course, I did read up on this. I have another book that's pretty neat. And the author mentioned 5 perennial herbs. One of them's not actually a perennial, but we can treat it like that. But these are, you know, oregano, Greek and Italian. You can see that the Italian might be a little more vigorous. And contrary to rosemary, which is kind of good looking, oregano is just, in looks department, it's like, if it didn't taste good, we would have never heard of it. Because it's I won't call it ugly, but, well, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's like nobody looks at oregano and goes, ooh. They might do that when they taste it, but not when they look at it. And, of course, rosemary was one of them. And thyme was another one, which, amazingly, we don't have thyme. You know, very small leaves, different flavors, very hardy, evergreen, tough. Most of these guys like that. The oregano also, decent drainage and sun. that makes it work. And of course, Italian parsley, we have different varieties. Right now I don't have the curly. It's going to sail right through the winter. I've never seen one hurt by cold, and which I'm, like I say, not a guarantee. But if it gets hurt by cold, we're going to hear about the cold on the news, you know. So that one, very nutritious and sails right through the winter. The curly one is really ornamental, and we'll be getting some of that. It's one of my favorites to plant with pansies and violas and all, because it's a neat texture, a neat color of green. And I have to mention this one. It's an annual, but cilantro, because I get questions about cilantro, and a lot of times I get those questions in June, July, August, and no, they're out. And maybe in Minneapolis they're happening in July, but not here. They're a spring and fall plant, so you can do cilantro now, and typically it's going to make it through the winter. But it does cool, but it doesn't do hot. And of course, I have had people ask about where's the coriander. You know, coriander, that's the seed that cilantro produces. It's the same plant, just a different part of it. Cilantro is the foliage, coriander is the seed. And I think these are the Rodney Dangerfields of herbs. Get no respect, and they should. The chives, very tough. Live a long time. They will bloom in the summer. The garlic chives will bloom white, and the regular chives will bloom pink. The flowers are edible. They're tough as nails. They get to be a bigger clump. They'll get up this tall, that big around, and if they get too big for you, you can divide them. That's how you would multiply them. And they are just tough, and a very useful culinary item.
How do you know when to harvest them? Does it matter? Okay.
Frequent clipping, they just, the more established they are, you know, it's like a lot of things. If they've got a root base, when you clip it, they're going to replace that quickly. That's not I mean, you could cut it completely off, and a day or two later, you'll see it coming back. So they're tough. And let's see. And a last one, the sage, and this one is a Bergarten, which has a much bigger leaf. And so if you get one going now, you'll have some for the turkey. And these are another one that's highly ornamental. The leaves get much bigger and kind of a gray cast to them, and very hardy. They'll go through the winter. And that's another one that I plant sometimes in containers with mixed things, flowers and all kind of things. I'll put some of those in there for a neat looking foliage item. So a very tough plant. And then I'll mention the big guy here. How many people like what is it? The state soup of Louisiana. With shrimp. Anybody? Gumbo. There you go. Now, if you've had gumbo, if you haven't seen one of these leaves, well, then I don't know that you've had gumbo, because when you have gumbo, you're going to run into 2 or 3 leaves of bay leaves in that gumbo. So, a big, tough plant, evergreen. And I did recently do the check on, they had one at the Fort Worth Botanical Gardens in the perennial garden, and it was like 20 feet tall. And after we had the big freeze, last year, I thought, well, that was pretty harsh. And of course, for that thing to get to 20 feet, it had been there for decades. Well, that freeze got it. So that's why I say there aren't guarantees. But see, the previous time we had a freeze that bad was like 37 years ago. And before that, they didn't have one recorded that bad. So, I think it's a safe bet. You can plant bay leaves. They're a neat, just ornamental plant, and they do get big, full sun, and you're ready to make gumbo too. So you don't have to go far. And of course, the other thing I'll mention on these is pretty much everything best with 8 hours of sun or more. Sun makes it happen. And if you want a demonstration of that, over by our main entrance, I have a pot on this side with a canna in it. And then I have a pot on the other side with the identical plant in it, but it's sheltered most of the day or a lot of the day by a live oak, so it doesn't get nearly as much sun. The one that's out in the sun is 3 or 4 times as big as the one that doesn't get as much. So sun is what makes it happen. So preferably 8 hours or more. And I'll just do a quick run through on some things like turnips and radishes and root crops. You almost have to buy in seeds, which is no big deal. They're cheaper and it's easy. So, but we do have some of the different varieties of broccoli rob, which is kind of a smaller version, and that one's called rapini. Some neat bell star, and then we have things like mustard, turnips, beets, and carrots. You're always going to have to plant from seed. Now's the time you can get going on those. Here it is, parsnips, and of course here's the carrots for the kids, assorted colors. And then we have some neat lettuces that the other thing that seeds provide is you can get some varieties that you're never going to see in transplants, just because they can't do everything. And of course they're neat, and some of them, like these, some of it is lettuce, but also you got different items in there, not just lettuce, in the mix, which is neat. There's a chard, which is the Ford Hook Giant, green and white, and of course a neat kale called Dazzling Blue, and spinach, which we might. I thought we if we don't have some, we'll be getting some, but it's an easy one to do from seed. If you're going to do spinach seed, and it's one of the most cold tolerant, so if you're going to do those, you could do it at the end of September. It'd still be okay. And it's recommended on spinach. Put the seeds in water in your fridge for a day or two before you plant them. Helps to get them germinating and going. Turnip, which is kind of like a radish, but solid white. And then here's one, see, Mantang Hong. Not my native language, but that's neat because it's kind of white on the outside, looks like a watermelon inside. So, that'd be worth growing just to see it, and I'm sure it tastes good too. And then, of course, we already touched on the other radishes, Easter egg blends, French breakfast, and cherry bell. And let's see. And now, once you get them going, here we go. We gotta fertilize these guys. Here's an organic fertilizer, Happy Frog, and it's a 573. And of course the numbers, the first one's nitrogen, middle one's phosphorus, and the last one's potassium. So, and go by directions on those. And of course, you can put something like this in your planter, raised bed, flower bed, or pot, you know, to begin with. Go by directions. It's kind of a powdery type. And then, of course, this one's organic. This one's a synthetic, and it's a 722/8. And then, if you want to do, you could do some solid type fertilizer to begin with, and that will last over time. And as things start to grow, if you want to do a little shot in the arm, you can do it with a liquid. This is a synthetic 20-20-20, and you just dissolve it in water according to directions in water. And then the old standby fish emulsion, which is a 511, mostly nitrogen, obviously organic. And you might not enjoy being in the area right after you do it, but it won't last long. It got a little bit of a smell to it, but that way you know it's organic, you know. So, and of course, a lot of these things are foliage crops. And of course, what are foliage things susceptible to? Caterpillars. They're the bane of leaf crops. So this is a BT, and that's Bacillus thuringiensis, which bacillus means it's a bacteria. So don't drink it. Shake it up, dilute it by directions, and spray the foliage. It's organic. Basically what it is, it's a bacterial stomach poison for caterpillars. Doesn't bother anybody else, but when you spray it on the foliage and they consume it, they get a fatal tummy upset. They'll stop feeding pretty quickly, and within a day, they'll die. And of course, if you see little moths flying around your garden, they're probably laying eggs on the back of the leaves. So that would tell you it's probably time to spray some BT, because those eggs will be hatching out into most of what you see are the little cabbage loopers. They're about that long. They're only about that thin. They're little worms, but caterpillars have got big appetites, even little ones, so they can consume a lot. But like I say, if you've got this on the foliage, that kind of stops them in their tracks before they can do much. Okay. And if you're doing seeds, on the back of all the seeds, most of them, they'll have a little illustration of when your seed comes up, that's what it's going to look like, that little drawing there. So don't pick those weeds. Those are what you just planted. So, and it will also tell you how long to expect before they come up. Like this one is 5 to 10 days. And like I said, when I planted them, 5 days, I could see little bumps in the soil that were already coming up. And it'll give you the depth and spacing, and the spacing of the rows. And then it will also say thinning, and that's one of the important thing on radishes or turnips or things like that are bulbing things. They have to have room to bulb. So if you plant them too close together, and they've got a neighbor that's a half an inch away or a quarter of an inch away, and then a half an inch they got another one, and a quarter of an inch they got another one. They've got no room to expand. And oddly enough, that's about all it takes to put a stop to the productivity. You would think, well, they would cope somehow. No. If their neighbor is too close and they don't have room to spread out, they just go, well, I guess I'm just going to be making leaves this time. So you can do that two ways. If you're cheap like me, the radish seeds are relatively big, so you can make sure that they're at least an inch apart. And if it's something like a turnip, 2 to 4 inches apart, because they'll make a bigger bulb. So you can space them. If you're in too much of a hurry to do that, then you've got to come back and it'll tell you how many you've got to cut off to get them out of the way, which, like I said, I'm too cheap to do that. I take the time and get a little space between them, and then I forego that step. Takes a little longer to plant them, but I'm going to eat all of them. And let's see. And you can do it if you're going to do it in the ground. My assistant didn't make it in today. He usually does this. Here's just regular old potting soil. You can do these things in pots. If you're doing it in the ground, and you're amending the soil, planter's mix would be the thing. You can also add some compost. Planter's mix has got some of that compost in it, and aged pine bark and sphagnum peat, so it improves the texture and the fertility. If you're doing it in a big pot or a raised bed, we also have a raised bed mix, so you could use that as a primary ingredient for a raised bed, and also mix in some planter's mix. And you could also add a little bit of compost on top, kind of mix it up, water it in, and you're ready to go. And of course, I think of raised beds as they're just really, really big pots. The good thing about those is no weeds, and if you're living in a house somewhere around here, the soil depth in your yard is probably, you don't have to go deep before it's rock. So, and even if you don't have that, you probably have clay, which can turn into hard work. So a raised bed on top of the soil, you don't have to have sides, but that kind of helps. But, you can do a 6-inch will work on all of this stuff. 12 inches, 10 or 12 inches, even better. And then, of course, if you're doing seeds, we also have, I didn't bring it over, but we have a potting soil for seeds. So you could do small amounts of that, do your seeds, and then water them in. And I brought this guy just for a demonstration. It's my favorite watering can. See, it's kind of gentle. So you get close and kind of keep it moving around to where you're applying a soft little spray, and you're not washing your seeds, or whatever. The soil will just settle evenly, and you're good to go. But I'll repeat, on your seeds, that's one of the other reasons for failures with seeds is I've had people say, well, I planted a garden, I planted a bunch of seeds, and none of them came up. And I'll say, well, what kind of things did you plant? And we'll say this, and I'll say, well, how deep did you plant them? Well, like 2 inches. It'll tell you here, and most of the depths are not much, In fact, some of them, it's like if you've cultivated the soil and raked it out, you don't even go down. You just put it on there, and when you water it in, it does it. So always check on the depth that it's recommended there, and then water it in, and then you'll be good to go. And I brought these just for Gardening 101, just, to know your terms. How many people here think a 2x4 is 2x4? No. I think it's like 3 5/8 by 1.5. It's not 2x4. So there are standards, and here we'll just go over, just so you'll know, if you see it in literature or whatever, like containers, you can do this in this size pot. That's a 1 gallon nursery pot. That's a 3 gallon. That's a 5 gallon. Similar to a 3, just a little bit wider and taller. And that's a 15 gallon. So, you can garden in these guys. And of course, you'll see literature on the tag, it'll say spacing. So some things like a cabbage that, it'll more than fill this up. You're not going to plant 4 of them in there. You could put one in there with some radishes, and the radishes will be gone before the cabbage gets big. But, keep in mind how big things are going to get. And let's see, we've covered soils, fertilizers, and of course, just in general on watering, a moderate amount. What is moderate? Well, you don't want it soggy. Of course, it can be that kind of a little bit when you first water it, but then the plant will use some, it'll percolate down, some will evaporate, but you're looking for a moderate, not really dry and not really wet. So a lot of times, don't think of it as though anytime I water that the plant's going to appreciate it. No, if you're keeping the soil soggy, it will not. If it's got adequate water, it wants you to leave it at that. When it starts to dry out, then you can add some. And of course, a lot of this stuff, like lettuce, that's going to be pretty easy to tell, because when he wants a drink, he's going to wilt. And then when you water it, within 5 or 10 minutes, he's going to be back up, and it's like, well, there's the end of that mystery. And of course, in fact, I was going to tell you about this. This is mustard red giant, ornamental and edible, but this one is, I've watered a lot of things that are wilted to get them to come back up. This guy holds the record. I came in here on Sunday one time. We had a bunch of these in like gallon or 2 gallon pots that were big. And I came in like early Sunday afternoon, and those things were just absolutely crashed over the side of the pot, hanging straight down. And I watered them to help them out. And then I went to watering other things, and I happened back by, and somewhere between 5 minutes and 10 minutes at the most, these were plants that were like this tall, and I came by, it was at least 5, but it wasn't more than 10, and they went from complete drape, so all the way back, standing straight up to where they were before. So this is the record holder. I've never seen anything come back that quick. So look at your stuff morning and evening, and that way it'll help you be on target with your water. And
Is there a certain temperature we should stop watering at?
No, but that's a good question, because if they need a drink, they need a drink no matter what the temperature. But as things get cooler, they typically can go longer between having a drink. So when it's hot and breezy, really keep an eye out. When it cools off, they're not gonna dry out as quick, and it's not gonna be as critical, and probably they won't need quite as much water, because it won't be dry as far down. But adjust it according to the weather. Okay. thank you guys for coming. We have any questions, or how am I on time? Or
Good on time.
okay,
I
so
have a few questions.
okay,
One, I just purchased some raised beds,
uh-huh.
and I have one that's 42-inch round, and I want to do Brussels sprouts in
Mhm.
it. So, what are good companion plants to put in there with the Brussels sprouts?
Well, you can do, like I've already mentioned, radishes, because you're gonna,
I don't like radishes.
you know, they're gonna be harvested and gone. You can do kales, would be nice. You know, cabbage tends to get, but any of the kales, lettuce, collards, you can do. Any of the herbs around the sides are fun. So it's, and like I say, you know, it can get to the point where the lettuces and kales you'll be harvesting as it goes along. At some point, your main plant can crowd them out, and it's like, okay, they've done their deal. Now there's not room for them. They'll let the Brussels sprouts take over. Yeah. But a lot of things that are just foliage things would do pretty quick, you know, so they'll have their time. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back next week on trees.